Thanks for tuning in to the Football Talk Squadron. I'm Dutch.
And I'm Maul.
And this is wrapping up the next 2 weeks of college football, so weeks 3 and 4, coming to you after a pretty good week 4 slate that happened. But first, as always, past or present for guess the player. Which side do you want first?
Let's do present first.
All right, present is going to be guess the college. Best fullback, I would argue, in all of football right now, in Kyle Juszczyk.
One of the only fullbacks.
Yeah, the only ones.
Yeah, I don't know.
I want you to think.
Western Michigan.
No.
I have no idea.
Ivy League.
Yale.
Nope.
Harvard.
Of all, which it's funny because they talk about how smart he is, and then I looked it up this weekend. I was like, Harvard. And I was like, of course, like the only fullback in the NFL right now is also probably the smartest person on any NFL roster, and Kyle Juszczyk.
Dude,
he's a beast.
He's good. And like, leave it to Kyle Shanahan or like a coach like Kyle Shanahan, which, I mean, again, fullbacks just like aren't a thing anymore, but like taking someone like that who clearly is a skillful athletic dude and like using him not only, you know, to block and use his size, but like they're turning him into like remember Chris Cooley?
Yeah,
for the Redskins back in the day, like
his arm going through the wall.
That commercial.
Oh.
I mean, they're almost turning him into that like H-back, you know, where he's like kind of like a tight end, kind of like a fullback, but they're going to use him as a receiver. Like they've realized the talent that he has, and they're you know, Kyle Shanahan's using him appropriately.
Well, I mean, when you are able to take a fullback and put him in the slot, and he's able to run routes and catch as good as he is, it's why he's on an NFL roster.
I mean, yeah, it's just I feel like coaches who aren't Kyle Shanahan would misuse him, or like they wouldn't have him on the roster because like we don't want a fullback, you know what I mean? But that's why there's good coaches and bad coaches. Like a good coach like Kyle Shanahan is gonna be like, look, dude, we've got this guy who's got talent, and we're gonna do whatever we can to get him the ball and add another weapon to this already super powerful roster.
Yeah, and they got it for sure. All right, so
passed.
So I'm gonna give you a hint right off the bat. It's a wide receiver.
Okay.
Because the college is Monmouth. So, yeah, we'll start it off there. It is another hint. We grew up watching this guy. So, recent past, played for Dallas, then the Browns, and then the Eagles.
All right. Monmouth, Dallas, Browns, Eagles. And he's not a current player. This is a past player.
Past player. He is retired. He's a coach now in the league as a wide receiver coach. But in terms of his time in the NFL, his time in the NFL ended in 2015.
All right. I mean, I'll be honest. I don't know anybody who came out of Monmouth. I don't even know what state that's in. But Dallas, Browns, Eagles.
We'll see if I can. Here's another.
Yeah, I need another. What year did he get drafted?
Undrafted. Undrafted in 06. And here's my other big hint. Now, this is a personal bias, so it's maybe not that good of a hint. I think he was the most underrated receiver the Cowboys had during the Tony Romo era. Like, this dude, you could always count on him. Like, if there was a play to be made in the game and it wasn't Des Bryant, it was this guy that always somehow found a way to, like, make a catch. Every time I watched the Cowboys, as much as I hated them, this guy somehow always shined. He wasn't like someone that you would put on your fantasy roster because he just didn't catch enough. But
I would have said like Cole Beasley, but I know he played for the Browns or the Bills.
You're in the right direction.
So like a smaller slot receiver.
Bald head.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure he's bald.
It's not. I mean, not Jason Witten.
No.
Okay. So I know he was a tight end. I don't know if you're thinking bald head.
I'm really sure he was bald. I have to look it up now.
I don't know. You got me.
Miles Austin. I don't know if you. I know that was.
I do remember him.
Yeah. I saw a clip of him, and I just remember that was the type of guy that he's a step up from Cole Beasley for me. That he was just that guy that they could put in he was a slot receiver.
Yeah.
Like, here's a guy that he's going to create a mismatch. He never can be like your number one or something.
Yeah, he's a smaller dude.
Yeah. But he was good. As much as I hated the Cowboys, like, that dude always found a way to like be in those big games. Like, you're just like, who is this Miles Austin guy? And then they're like, I went to Monmouth, and you're like, where?
Monmouth.
Oh,
just another example of it from the NFL. Like, if you've got the talent, they will find you.
They will find you. I mean, you said that last week. It's great. Talking of talent, in terms of our college picks, I sort of want to start this off. So how we're going to approach this going forward for the listeners is this week we're going to look at the top 16 teams, mainly because I think that those are the teams that have the best chance of getting into the playoffs, but also I would say creating some disruptions.
Yeah.
I get there's like some off chance losses, but these are the teams that I would say they have the best chance of getting in. And I think so far the AP poll is pretty accurate.
Yeah, there's not a lot of people outside the top 16 that I feel like, even if they went on some magical run, there's not going to be so many slip-ups from the top 16 that they're going to somehow unseed, and make their way into the college football playoff.
Yeah, it's not a Cincinnati type of year where there's just one team that you're like, well, if they keep winning out and a bunch of teams lose, just because I think there's too many good teams up top right now for someone to like sneak in to the bottom. For me, this it's 4 weeks in, so you're sitting back and you get a little bit more of just what's happening right now with teams. Like, you're starting to see like, hey, was LSU really that good when Florida State played them? Is Bama who we thought they were?
I mean, kind of, because again, you get teams like Georgia who like still haven't played anybody. So there are teams that you have kind of like, you're starting to kind of figure them out. You're kind of seeing what they're made of. But then there's other teams that are just like, I can't wait until they actually play somebody good because I still haven't seen them.
For me, it is 100% that, but it's also, I sense that it's a different league than it was the past 2 years, where I find it's very quarterback centric this year. Like, you either have a quarterback or you don't. And there's not those positions, sort of like Georgia last year with their defense. It was like Georgia's defense won them games. This year, I don't find that any team really has that type of defense, or someone has like a running back or wide receiver room that's like they're unstoppable. It's really like, is your quarterback playing really well or are they not? And there's really no middle ground.
I mean, to be honest, the only team that I feel like has that on any side of the ball is USC. USC's offense is like the only... Now, again, their defense always kind of comes into question, and when they play somebody who has a really good defense, we'll see how that is. But like, USC to me is the only team right now where when they get the ball on offense, it's like not a if they're going to score, it's just like how many points are they going to score, or like how quickly, right? Like, it's just like this game that they're playing with themselves of like how quickly are they going to score, how many points are they going to put up. But you're right. There's not really that Georgia type of defense or any other team that's like so dominant, that it's just like a foregone conclusion of like what's going to happen every time they get the ball or the other team gets the ball.
And I mean, starting with Georgia, they're the number 1 seed right now. For me, I think that the way me personally summing it up, it's not if, it's when with Georgia that they get caught. Like, I just, their defense isn't that unstoppable for us this year, and Beck is struggling.
I would love to say when, but the problem is, look at the schedule. I mean, it's just not there. Like, when it's not going to happen. The only time I can see it is in my prediction is if Bama continues to stay undefeated in the SEC and they meet in the SEC championship. I don't think Bama's offense is really that good. So like, Georgia can squeak by then. So like, the only time I could even say when with Georgia is like in the CFP, right? And like I said this at the beginning, if I was Bama or Georgia, I'd be doing the exact same thing they are. Is I'm not going to play anybody hard because all I got to do is show up and you're going to put me in the CFP. Now I know that's not their end goal, but like that's the first step, right? Like, and we talked about this. Bama a few years ago, now they won the national championship this year, but like, again, it's like, I don't need to do anything in the regular season. I could even lose my division, lose my conference. All I got to do is make it to the CFP and I got a chance.
Well, they didn't even make it in the conference championship
No,
that
that's
year.
what I'm saying.
Yeah.
But it's like, as Georgia, like, and we talked about this, like, their schedule may come back to bite them if it comes down to, like, a one-loss Georgia because they lose in the SEC championship versus, like, a one-loss, I don't know, Michigan who loses to Ohio State or something to that nature. But honestly, like, it might end up being their saving grace because it's like they're not playing that well. They don't look like the Georgia of the last 2 years, but they're not playing anybody who's even going to catch them. Like, they could fall asleep at the wheel and still be okay because there's just nobody that they're playing that has any talent.
Yeah, it's definitely one that, as I still think the off chance that they get beat is at Tennessee. That's now it all comes down to can Milton hit the deep ball? Like, and right now the answer to that question is no.
Ole Miss, again, we can get to this point. Ole Miss is another maybe test that is a talented team that
What Ole Miss shows up?
Yeah, exactly. Because if it shows up like they did against Bama, like they're gonna lose, and they're just. It's going to be the classic Ole Miss where, like, they've got all this talent and putting up all these points, but anytime it's a big game, they fold.
But I feel like we see this type of team every year, and this is sort of the problem with the CFP, is they will never pull this team out. They never punish them for their schedule, but I think everyone can tell they're not one of the best four teams.
No, and this is why I got to, like, I hate preseason rankings, and I hate rankings. I hate the way that the college football system is set up because teams like this can get away with that, right?
100%.
Like, they don't. I wish we just went out there and played a bunch of games against good opponents, and it didn't matter whether you lost or won. I mean, it does matter, but, like, if Bama and Georgia or, like, and that level of competition was playing every single week, you could really get a good estimate or a good ranking on, like, how good is that actual team, right? Like, LSU and Florida State. Big matchup at the beginning of the year, but, like, when LSU lays an egg, is like, oh, well, maybe LSU's not that good, right? Like, there's all these questions, but you don't know. But we go in with this confirmation bias of, like, oh, well, they're the number 6 team in the nation. They must be good. And it's like, Texas A&M, again, thank you for proving my point. They keep earning these, SEC bias rankings that are completely undeserving of it. So when a team beats them, sure, at the time it seems like a big win, but when you kind of go back and look at it, it's like, well, that wasn't that big of a win because that team's not that good this year. And I wish we did that from the get-go without all of these preconceived biases, because
it's almost like if we went back to the beginning of the year at the end, like before we selected bowls, and be like, what were teams truly ranked?
Yeah.
And then played that out throughout the season to say, oh, it turns out that you didn't play any ranked matchups because all these teams were terrible.
I mean, perfect example, Colorado. And I don't get me wrong, I love what Deion is doing, and I think it's wonderful. And I'm all for Team Colorado, except this week because they're playing USC. But, like, I love what they're doing, right? And when they beat TCU, huge win at the time. TCU's ranked. They went to the Natty last year, but even TCU fans would tell you it's a completely different team.
Yeah.
They were undeserving of the number 21 ranking, right?
I think there were 17.
And because Colorado, all of a sudden it's like, Colorado's great, put them on the map. They face one good opponent, right? Because I don't even think TCU was that good of an opponent, and it was a close game. That's what made it seem like it was so much better of a game because it was so close.
Yeah.
But if TCU, wasn't ranked, maybe they don't care. Then they beat Nebraska, who, it's like Nebraska's whatever. Colorado State, everybody knows is not good, and they struggled with, right?
Through overtimes.
Right, exactly, right? And it's like, again, there's this huge hype around Colorado, and they're ranked and all this stuff because they've got all these preconceived notions, and then they show up and play a real team in Oregon and get the brakes beat off of them.
The Colorado situation, I think that it's sort of what we thought was going to happen at the beginning of the year, and it didn't. The signs to me were there in the Colorado State game because there was that one guy on the defensive line that was just tormenting Colorado the whole game until he ended up getting ejected, I think, in the first overtime or right at the end of the fourth quarter because of a targeting. But the trenches is where you win games. Bama this year, think about it. Bama gets top 3 recruiting classes year after year after year. They can't get 5 guys right now on the offensive line to block. This idea that Colorado was going to go out into the portal and just pull all these guys in, and it was going to be this magical season. Like, and don't get me wrong, I'm in the same boat. Like, Team Deion, the success that he has.
Oh, it's phenomenal. I love it.
Yeah. But there needed to be some realistic expectations that just showed up during the Oregon game. I think even Vegas knew it with a 21-point spread, that, hey, in terms of especially talent up front and then depth behind that, like, you may be able to get 5 guys on the defensive line, but you need 10 of them to rotate throughout the game. Colorado didn't have it.
Exactly. And like, again, this is kind of a long tangent on all my point is that these rankings at this point in the season and preseason rankings are completely and utterly bogus and useless, except that it forms a bias in people's minds about who's good and who's not. And it's like this self-licking ice cream cone of like trying to keep these relevant teams relative when they shouldn't be, because they don't actually have the talent that are deserving of these rankings.
Or we're going to get to a little conspiracy theory that I have on the number 3. But for the number 2, it's very similar with Georgia and Michigan. Both are playing very cupcake schedules. The difference is we'll eventually find out who Michigan is. And for me, the question for Michigan, which I think all Michigan fans are going to say the same thing, is can we not stumble up until November?
Listen, they're winning, and they're winning by decent margins. But from a betting man and a guy who picked Michigan to win the national championship, they've yet to cover the spread.
No, they haven't. And the whole year.
And it'd be one thing if these spreads were like huge numbers, but they're like in the 20s. Things that are like a future national championship against like Rutgers should be easily covering, and they're just not. So again,
they're
it's like,
very sloppy.
Yeah,
right now.
it's like I'm not saying that they're not a good team, but like they're not giving me the confidence from someone who picked them to win the national championship, where I'm like, they've definitely got it. I'm watching those games going like, they're easily beatable by a good team.
And the only thing that's saving Michigan right now is they don't play anybody until November, because they go to. That will be. I mean, it will be a huge game going into Penn State. Guarantee you, it's at night. It'll be a whiteout. We'll see if Penn State's undefeated at that point, because they'll play Ohio State in October. But then it's at Maryland, and then it's the game against Ohio State. Now, it's at Michigan, which helps, but it's between those 3 teams in the Big Ten.
This kind of goes, we're going back to Georgia on like, we talked about their schedule might hurt them, but this is where I say their schedule's actually helping them. Right? Because Michigan's got to play Ohio State and Penn State, which Penn State's always kind of just been a resume booster for those other 2 teams. But who knows? Penn State might show up this year, right? Like Texas doesn't really play anybody since they've already beat Bama, but like USC, Washington, Oregon, all those teams they all got to play each other. Utah, like they're all going to knock each other out of contention, or someone's got to lose in those games. Whereas Georgia's just like,
yeah,
they don't got to play anybody.
Another UT Martin,
yeah,
please.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll just keep winning these games, and I'll just take my free CFP walk.
Which, I mean, UAB putting up 20 plus on them. It's one of those ones that you watch and you're like, hey, like, you can't continue to say as a Georgia fan that, oh, we're just not playing real opponents, so we're sleepwalking through it.
They've started extremely slow, and it could be, college kids are different than NFL professionals, right? Like NFL professionals show up, and I don't care if it's the Texans or the Cardinals or whatever. Like,
Cowboys didn't show up.
Well, exactly. Well, when they show up, they're still professionals, right? But college kids, they're different in that mindset because they're not professionals, and like it could be like Georgia dudes could be walking into these games like it's UT Martin. It's UAB. Like, I thought they canceled their football program. You know what I mean? They could be walking into these games thinking, like, we've got this in the bag. We're back-to-back national champions. And that's why they're starting slow. They always seem to figure it out. And, again, it could be just because it's against a weak team. But they're starting slow. And if they start slow against a good team, they don't have an explosive offense to come back. Now, I say that in – maybe these dudes show up when it's like, hey, we got Bama in the national or in the SEC championship,
or Michigan with Penn State,
or something, right? Like maybe they show up ready to go right from the get go, but I just haven't seen it yet because all of their games have been against absolute cupcakes.
Yeah, and so we'll know more. It's really, can Michigan avoid doing the loss? It's like now I will say the last 2 years they haven't, and it seems that they get so hyped up to beat Ohio State, and then they go into the CFP, and that's where they fall asleep and they end up losing their first game, and it kills them. But we'll see how Michigan plays out. The number 3 team, and this is where my conspiracy comes in. So we haven't talked about this, but we'll see what you think. So it's Texas. They play Kansas next week. Okay. Kansas somehow jumped up to the number 24 team in the nation, which I sat back and I was looking at Power 5 schools that are undefeated right now. Kentucky, Maryland, Syracuse, Louisville. Kansas State has played, or Kansas, excuse me, not Kansas State. Kansas has played Montana State, Illinois, Nevada, and BYU. Number 24 team. I think that this is purely for padding.
Resume booster. Like they've been doing this since the beginning of time. It just so happens that this is not an SEC school that because now there's all this hype around Texas. But they've been doing this with the SEC since the beginning of it. Like they
drives me crazy.
Yeah, you're an SEC fan, so
well, I know. But
welcome to the rest of the crowd.
Yeah, I just look at it and I go, they're going to use this, especially if they stumble against Oklahoma. They're like, well, they have Bama, they have Kansas, they only lost to Oklahoma. You know, if they came back and beat them in the Big 12, then, you know, they still have these 2 great wins because they have 2 top 25 wins. And that's the type of stuff that I wish that we would take a pause and go, we don't even know who Kansas is yet. Like, I get that
we don't know who half or more, 75% of these top 25 teams are.
Not arguing that, but it's these games that we play. Because I'm in a big boat that even though I'm a Bama fan, Bama shouldn't be ranked as high as they are. In my opinion, Bama's not a top 25 team. Now, I know that's a stretch, especially when we get to the bottom of this 25. Is Bama better than Kansas? I would like to say so, just from their defense perspective and just talent around the football. But in terms of, hey, I look at the roster and I go, is Bama the number 12 team in the nation? No. Like, in my opinion, just based upon how they're playing, I wouldn't put them that high. It's one of those ones that ultimately for Texas, they meet Oklahoma in 2 weeks. So the Red River's going down. That's going to determine the Big 12 as long as they don't stumble. Texas and Oklahoma have both shown that the past few years, that it's always Kansas State or Kansas or Iowa State. Like somehow
somebody who has no business beating them
beats them. Yeah. And then they sit back and they're like, but we won the Big 12. And people like,
don't care.
Yeah, you still lost to Iowa State, at home by 20. So we'll see how Texas does. The next school up is Ohio State. Big win at Notre Dame. But for me, I still have major concerns with the QB.
See, but this is a perfect example of that game showed us basically who both those teams were.
Yeah.
It was good competition against good competition. Somebody's got to lose. Notre Dame should have won that game. I think they looked like the better team pretty much all game. And then, they put 10 guys on the field for the last 2 plays. Mistakes were made. But you don't necessarily fault Notre Dame and think oh, well, they're out of it, right? Which the way our college system or the CFP system works is they're kind of almost out of it now, just based on how everybody else is ranked. But it just goes to show if we had more games like this, we would get a better idea of who's actually better than who, other than, Georgia just kind of hiding behind the curtains going ooh, man, I would never play a top 10 team. That opens me up to risk.
So it's funny that I'll just jump to Notre Dame now. So I'm going to present this scenario. I was going to save it, but I want you to think about this because this is sort of my argument for Notre Dame strength of schedule and anti-Georgia schedule. So let's say that Notre Dame loses one more game, but it's to USC. But then they went out and they play Florida State in the ACC championship, and Florida State's undefeated, and they beat Florida State. So now they're the ACC champ. You knocked off Florida State, and you have 2 losses. One's to Ohio State, and let's just say that they win their division, and the other is to USC, and let's say they win the Pac-12. In my opinion, why should Notre Dame be punished for playing those schools when Georgia played no one, especially if Georgia doesn't get any type of competition in the SEC championship? That's where I just sort of sit back and I'm like, I think the committee, they will 100%, there's no way they're ever going to leave out of undefeated Georgia, but there needs to be some type of recognition that it's Notre Dame went out and played literally two. Well, it's really three because they got Clemson later. I get Clemson's down this year, but they are playing three bigger name schools when Georgia played no one.
You're absolutely right. And we've talked about this. That's the problem, though, with the way this committee is built and the way that the CFP is run is that, yeah, we'll give Notre Dame brownie points, but it's like, who cares? Like, teams that don't come in as top 5 favorites have to play these hard games just to prove themselves, whereas teams like Georgia can just show up, live, breathe, and walk themselves into a CFP. Because I'm with you. Like they use that whole like, oh, you know, who's the actual better team? You know, because Bama was trying to do that last year with like, if we put Bama and TCU on the field, who's going to win? Everyone's like, probably Bama. Well, then we should be in the CFP. No, dog. Sorry, you lost. You get punished when you play a tough schedule, and that's what I don't like about it. Because you're encouraging these UT Martin games. You're encouraging Ball State games. Like, why, if I had any shot at the CFP, why not come out, play nothing but cupcakes, put up 70 burgers on everybody, just look like absolute all-stars? We'll worry about facing the competition when it's after New Year's. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. And it's easy for a team to get motivated for like you said, the motivation builds. Who knows what you see out of Georgia, and they could easily win it. But then you sit back and you go, well, they probably should have never been in it because they didn't play anybody. But, we'll see what happens with Ohio State. For me, just to go back to them, for as much talent they have offensively, that quarterback still looks lost. And he made the plays that he needed to get them down the field. It helped that Notre Dame didn't have an extra guy on the field. And you watched their zone coverage, and Njigba was just running free the whole game there at the end, and you were just like, God bless.
Marvin Harrison?
No, Njigba is the other wide receiver that was catching those passes there at the end. Marvin Harrison Jr. is still on the team. Smith Njigba is now with the Seahawks, but there's another guy named Njigba.
Okay.
And he's the guy that caught it right at the one. But he was having a really – Ohio State has been producing wide receivers pretty prolifically the past few years. And you sit back and you go, they should be better. And with C.J. Stroud, they were. You're not seeing that type of competence. And you can't really blame coaching because it's the same coaching staff. So you sort of sit back and you're like, hey, will they get caught? We'll find out in the middle of October when they play Penn State, who's the next team in the top 25. And I would say of the Big Ten schools, they're playing the best now.
Surprising. Yeah, they surprised me. I didn't think – I thought they were going to kind of be the typical Penn State where it's like, yeah, they got talent. They're usually a pretty good team. They're going to beat a lot of teams, but they're usually just a resume builder for Ohio State and Michigan. And this is probably that year, a few years back where they had Hamler. I can't remember.
They've had teams that you were like, and that's my question. Can they win at Ohio State?
Ohio State, Michigan. This is the first year where I feel like because the other two teams don't look as strong as I thought they were, Penn State has a chance against them.
In my question for them of can they win at Ohio State, the reason that's so important is they get Michigan at home. If they can go to the Horseshoe and beat Ohio State, they set themselves up that once they beat Michigan, we're going to the Big Ten championship.
Again, though, another example of even if Penn State wins 1 out of 2 of those,
they're punished for losing the other one.
They're punished, and it's like they may have to face that other team again. Right? Whereas Georgia's not playing any of these teams twice. They're not going to face Missouri or South Carolina in the SEC championship game. It's not going to happen. You know what I mean? They're punished for having to play a harder schedule. And it irks at me as a fan because you want to see those good matchups week in and week out.
I just hope that Penn State puts up a good – when it comes time, this has been the thing with Penn State for me. James Franklin has this nerve to him that he will do something dumb coaching-wise during a game. It'd be like 4th and 34, 39-yard field goal, and we're going to run a fake on 4th and 34. And you're like, what were y'all doing? It's too much. And they run some plays, especially in these bigger games, that you sit back and you're like, who drew that up? Was that literally in the water boy, like drawing it on the chartboard, like, hey, we're going to run this magical play. Like, that's how I feel Penn State is every year. They look really good this year. We'll find out here in a few weeks who Penn State really is. Up next for me, it's Washington. And my question for, I guess you is, I sort of feel like they're the number one team.
Dude, I don't know. I watched that Oregon game, and again, I thought Oregon was going to destroy Colorado. Like, I picked them to win by more than 21 points. But watching that Oregon game is like, whew, they're good. I mean, like, it helps when you got a 8th-year senior playing quarterback, right? Like, I saw the stat. They said Bo Nix played against Justin Herbert. And Justin Herbert's been in the NFL for 4 years.
Yep.
So, I mean, like, I don't know how that works. But, like, sure. They looked good, though, too. The Pac-12 is, I mean,
stacked,
dangerous this year. And, again, back to Georgia of, like, you could put 4 teams from the Pac-12 in the CFP. And that would be a great CFP. I mean, you could have Utah, Oregon, Washington, USC. Shoot, you could throw Washington State in there. And, I mean, like, it's a solid conference right now. So, I mean, I don't – it's hard to tell. Like, Penix Jr. is great. The quarterback play in the Pac-12 is pretty much what's doing it. But they're dangerous schools. Washington, I feel like, has always been one of those schools, like we've talked about it, that, like, will lose to Cal. Like, they're destroying everybody. They'll beat USC. They'll beat Utah. But then, like, you lose to Cal. Or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, they always do those random stumbles. And unless you're in the SEC, if you don't run the table, you're out.
We'll see. And the problem with, and we'll get to it, especially here in a few weeks, is that the Pac-12 is about to go through a gamut where the back end of the season is just they're playing one another every single week.
And nobody's going to see it.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be at 11 o'clock at night or on the Pac-12 network where nobody can tune in.
And I know we haven't talked about college football for 2 weeks. That Colorado State game kicking off at 10 p.m., that should have been a crime.
Yeah, foul.
Like, what in the world? I'm glad. I literally recorded. I woke up in the morning. I was like, I'll just watch it. And when it went to overtime, I, like, checked the time on the TV, and I was like, well, if it'd been 2 o'clock in the morning. It was like, no one's watching these games.
And that's been the Pac-12's downfall since its inception, you know, of the BCS and the CFP. Like, ever since Reggie Bush and them fell out of favor and the USC's kind of...
Thanks, Pete Carroll.
Yeah. Ever since those seasons and, you know, Pac-12 wasn't super relevant anymore, they've been pushed to their West Coast times, and that's why the Pac-12 hasn't been really relevant in any of the CFP discussions because nobody watches them. I mean, like, USC has fallen to what, 8th now? Like, you've got a returning Heisman winner who's putting up 5 touchdowns a game, and they're just killing everybody, but they're falling in the rankings because nobody's watching them. Nobody's seen the games. I'm a diehard USC fan, and I've only been able to watch one half of the entire season because of how late it is or it's on the Pac-12 network.
I don't argue with you. They are the next team in the poll of USC. The only thing about USC that I think people realize, and even you being a diehard USC fan realize, is their defense is just suspect. Like,
it is.
They didn't look good going down to Arizona State. And I know that this is not the game that everyone hoped it would be because people were hoping Colorado would beat Oregon and go into USC. I think this is a bigger game for USC against Colorado now because if Colorado comes out and throws for 500 yards and puts up these gaudy numbers, even if USC still wins by 20, 30 points, it will just sort of tell the rest of the Pac-12, like, hey, just so you know, our defenses are better than Colorado's. When you play us, you better hope you score 100 or else you're not winning the game.
And it's going to be like, you know, we know that sports don't work this way, but everybody's going to do the whole, like, Oregon stiffed them. Like, they barely scored there at the end. Oregon dominated that game. So if USC lets Colorado score, because you could compare Oregon's offense and USC's offense as far as, like, high power, like, big threat, big plays. And if Colorado scores a lot more points on USC than they did on Oregon, everybody's going to be like, see, like, they can't score that many points, to overcome how bad their defense is.
100%.
We did skip Florida State, though, if you want to go back.
I did. Well, thank you for Florida State, number 5. That's my bad. For me, they only have one game left in the schedule that I think is their possible moment to choke. It's Miami. I can see Miami before the ACC title game. There's a couple teams in the ACC title game that will see what happens. One of them is UNC. So UNC, I like UNC. I don't feel like UNC is good enough to challenge Florida State, especially in the trenches. But Miami always has speed. Like, they are in the mecca of college recruiting. Miami has good players on their team. That could be a game that I can see Florida State walk into, and it's a rivalry game. Like, anything happens. Like, that would make Miami's year to beat Florida State.
I think this Clemson game was good for Florida State, and especially the fact that they won.
Yeah.
If they lost, it would have been pretty detrimental because of how bad Clemson is this year. But I think, they maybe walked into that game a little bit like Clemson's not that good this year. We're really good this year. We've got this in the bag. And Clemson, even though it's not that good of a team, showed up like
it was just that game that Florida State needed.
You still gotta play these games, like you said, rivalry games, and some of these big, like, you still gotta show up and show out. Otherwise, you'll get caught. And I think it's what Florida State needed, that they're not gonna let that happen, because they realized, this could be our year. I mean, they're right there, like, they can make the CFP, and the two of the teams ahead of them are in the same conference. So if as long as they win out, those two, right? Like, they're going to. And I think this Clemson game was that little bit of like, this can get taken away from us really quickly if we don't show up. So
they play Miami in November, so that's the only reason I say I think that's the choke game. I know people are going to be like, what about Florida? It's like, no. Like, Florida was struggling with Charlotte the other day, and you just sit back and, typical mouth breather of Napier just standing there on the sideline. Florida is such a waste of potential that it drives me crazy with them. So really, Florida State, it's not until Miami and ultimately until the ACC title game.
Can we just talk about Florida real fast, or this whole situation again? And it's this rankings thing, and I can't get off of it. I know people are gonna be like, "You're dead horse," it's beaten, but like, Florida is not good. We know Florida's not good.
And they're in the top 25.
But they beat Tennessee, right? So it's like, oh, they beat Tennessee. It's got to be top 25. Let's put them in there. It's like, well, is Tennessee that good? No. Like, they've struggled with every team they've played so far. Now, if you look at the end score, like, box score, you know what I mean? Like, sure, they've won by a decent amount, but it's like they struggled with Virginia. Like, they're not that good of a team. I know everybody wants them to be because they've got a big following, and they beat Alabama last year, and like, they've got this thing that they think they're going to beat Georgia, but like, Tennessee's not that good of a team. So Florida beating them doesn't all of a sudden make them deserve to be in the top 25. Like,
yeah, I agree. It's one of these ones where, as the season plays out, I think, thank goodness this season, I feel like there's enough talent up top that sort of pushes some of these bottom dwellers out.
Yeah, I don't know. And they're not going to be relevant. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day, like, where Florida's ranked. It's just the ranking thing. It's like you said with the conspiracy theory. It's always this like self-licking ice cream cone of like, oh, we got to keep these teams, ranked appropriately so that when they beat each other, we can show how good the other team is based on their strength of schedule from the past.
Yeah, 100%. We talked about Oregon a little bit. The next team up is Utah. For me, the question with Utah is Cam Rising going to come back? And if he does, what Cam Rising do we see? Because if we see the one that played last year against USC, then Utah has a chance. Like, Utah is a very disciplined team. They are very well, and that's because they're well coached. Utah has the ability to beat anyone in their schedule, but Utah also has the ability right now to lose to anyone.
They've had that for the last 3 years. Like, they could beat anybody on any given day, but then also lose to somebody they have no business losing to on any given day. Like, you're right. It just depends on which Utah shows up.
So, I mean, they're going to end up playing, I think, Washington here in a few weeks, and that will sort of start this train in the Pac-12 of seeing
like
what
you
happens.
Said, the gamut of like Washington, Oregon, USC, Utah all play each other. UCLA I think gets mixed in there, and again they're in the later rankings. I don't even know if they got kicked out of the rankings this last week, but
UCLA did get punched from the rankings.
Yeah, but still they were ranked. They're a good team. All of them play each other right there at the end of the season here, the next five or so weeks, and it's just gonna hopefully. I hope that someone comes out a clear winner. I hope they don't all just like onesie twosie beat each other, and then it's like, well, none of you get in. Like that. That's not what I want to see, because they're clearly, the best looking conference right now. You want to see one of them work their way to the top and compete for one of those top 4 slots. But you hope that they don't all knock each other out.
Yeah. And we'll just see as the season goes on. It's a little early to tell. The next team up is Notre Dame, which we already talked about. I think Notre Dame, if I was their head coach, what I'm telling them is the season is far from over.
Yeah, if Notre Dame's only loss at the end of the year is Ohio State,
they're in.
They've got a great shot.
No, they're in, because they have to play Florida State in the ACC championship. So they will have beat USC. If they beat Clemson more, I guess better. I don't want to say more better. It's not a good English. If they dominate Clemson like they did last year, because they'll go to Clemson as well as Florida State did, and then have to play Florida State, Notre Dame's in. They have too big of a following to only have one loss to Ohio State.
I wouldn't say guaranteed that they're in. I could see a scenario where it's like Georgia, Ohio State, Texas, and then let's say like Washington beats everybody.
If you had 4 undefeateds, but it's never happened. That I 100% agree. If there's 4 undefeateds in it's all the other Power 5 conferences and they're undefeated. Yes, Notre Dame gets left out because they have the one loss.
Or so like what if?
But that's in my scenario. Georgia should be left out.
What if Michigan beats Ohio State, and then whatever happens, Michigan stays undefeated. So Ohio State's only one loss is now to Michigan. And then it's Georgia, Texas, Michigan. They're putting in Ohio State over Notre Dame. I agree with you. Like, they have a good resume and they have a really strong opportunity to still make it. I wouldn't say, though, that they're guaranteed in, though, if they've only got the one
This
loss.
is just, we go back to, I feel like we're beating a dead horse. This is where Georgia's schedule should bite them in that scenario.
Should, but it's not going to.
It's not going to. The next team, Bama, me and you were both surprised because I openly said I thought Ole Miss was going to beat the brakes off of them. And it was one of those games, we were sort of talking about this earlier. I could not tell whether Bama's defense showed up or whether Ole Miss just didn't. And we were sort of talking, it seemed like there was a mixture of both.
Ole Miss had every right to win that game.
Yes.
And all of the ability to win that game. Like, this was the one time Lane Kiffin could have beat Saban. Like, he had it in the bag. I do think Bama's defense showed up and played better than they have all season, but Ole Miss absolutely showed up and laid an egg. So, and it was still close. And that's where, like, as a Bama fan, I know you're kind of worried because you feel probably how every other team in the last 12 years has felt when they play Bama and they're winning, where they're just like, oh, we have no business winning this game, but we might pull it out. That's probably how you felt watching that game, because you were like, oh my God, we shouldn't be beating Ole Miss because they're clearly a better team than us, but we might pull this out because they're sucking today. It was just one of those, like, the gods had chosen it that they're, Ole Miss was going to make a lot of mistakes, and Bama was able to capitalize on it.
What I wrote down for Bama is, how many games is their offense going to cause them to lose? If their offense can get better and figure it out, and I know people are going to say, oh, this is Bama bias. I get it. If Bama figures it out offensively and they keep winning and keep surging, and let's say they beat Michigan, there will be no more dangerous team in the playoff. Like, that's a team that no one wants to play going into it if they have it, because they've done this in the past, and I've watched them do it 4 times where they have a loss early in the season and then they just build and they're angry and they go into the playoffs. I do not think that happens.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think the only reason people wouldn't want to play Bama is simply because it's Bama. This team, though, this year
It's not Bama.
is, I don't think, as skillful or as disciplined as any team. I mean, I'm talking heads and shoulders difference of your previous teams. So even if I think you guys go on a run, people might be afraid of you because it's Bama, but I still just don't think you guys have the skill or the discipline to like really make that run in a consistent way.
I still think our next loss is at Texas A&M. And it's because it will be at A&M. A&M has a good defense in terms of just the quality of opponents that Bama will have seen. I think they're better in that sense, and they'll score just a little. It's not like they're going to blow them out of the water. It's not like what I thought Ole Miss would do. It'll be like a 24-14 game where it's just like Bama could never find traction. Texas A&M, put up 13 in the first half and just sort of kept it that way, kept the distance the whole time.
I hope you're wrong, simply for the fact that even though everything I just said about Bama, I still think they're like the only team that can challenge Georgia in the SEC championship. So I don't want Bama to stumble because I want Bama to face Georgia in the SEC championship, right? Like I don't want it to be like a Ole Miss or like I don't even know who else could, maybe an LSU. I just don't see anybody else with the caliber that could really make it a good game in the SEC championship.
Well, LSU is the next team, and my question for them was LSU, because I can't figure out who this team is. Like, for as much, it's weird. They have the game versus Bama last year. They win. And then they're doing the exact same thing they did last year. They go to Arkansas, they struggle. They somehow squeak it out. Same thing this year. And then they went to the SEC championship, and you were like, dude, who is this team that we put into the SEC championship?
Like, this just goes to show you, though, like, again, back to the rankings of, like,
well, the rankings didn't have anything with them getting into the SEC championship.
No, but, like, it just shows that, like, these teams that we, like, put on these pedestals of, like, they're the number 6 team in the like, every team has weaknesses. Like, they're not these, like, oh, it just means more in the SEC. BS. Like, everybody is the same as far as, like, ultimate makeup. No team just gets to walk out there and say, we win because we're in the SEC or, we're higher ranked than you. You know what I mean? Like, and LSU was that last year. Like, they have bad games. Like, and that's why I don't like the way the CFP is built, because it doesn't allow for that. Like, you have to have this, like, perfect.
This year.
Well, these last 2 years have been kind of an oddity.
Well, I'm saying once we go to a 12 team.
Yeah, sure. I'm just, in the past, before last year, in the past, it was like, and I know it's never happened, but it was like, if you're not undefeated, you don't have a chance. And like, that was the mentality. When in reality, it's like, dude, if we play good teams, you shouldn't be expected to be undefeated. It should just be like, who comes out on top and who at the end of the day looks like the best team. But when you have these teams that are just playing absolute cupcake schedules, you don't get an opportunity to actually see that.
It needs to become more like the NFL, that being undefeated is a true rarity.
Yeah.
Because you're playing, like you said, interconference matchups that mean something.
High quality teams.
That you're expected to not go undefeated through the year. So there's more of I don't want to say a bias, but more of a forgiveness of sorts for having a loss or two on your schedule, because it's like, look, no one's doing it because everyone's playing hard teams. Like, and who knows, maybe Vanderbilt squeaks out an undefeated season because they didn't play anybody. It was the one year that they drew, we got Kentucky, South Carolina, Missouri. Like, it wasn't until the SEC championship.
Vanderbilt still got 1-3.
Yeah. Anchor down, baby. Poor Vanderbilt fans. The next team, as we start to wrap it up with the bottom three, got Oklahoma, UNC, and Washington State. For me, these three teams I would equate in the same boat. They're going to be someone's giant killer.
Yeah. They're going to ruin somebody's playoff chances.
Yes.
Oklahoma has shocked me with how good they are. Going into the season, I had them as like a, because it's Oklahoma, I played into the brand name, but I really didn't expect them to play as well. And my picks have kind of shown that. Like, I never pick them to cover. And again, I know they put up like 70 on whoever it was,
Arkansas State.
Arkansas State. But that was kind of like, oh, it's probably just Arkansas State. And then they show up the next week and like do it again, and you're like, well, maybe this team's actually better than I thought. So yeah, Texas better watch out. But you're right, like they're probably only gonna like ruin Texas's chances. They're probably not gonna actually make it. North Carolina, same way. They're probably just going to ruin maybe Florida State's chances. Washington State, and again, this is just because it's the Pac-12. There's so many other teams. Like,
if it was just Oregon, I would say Washington State has a chance to win it.
Yeah.
Like, win the Pac-12. But the issue is they've got to go through 4 different teams that you sit back and you're just like, yeah. Like, they're gauntlets. And even the funny school, because I'm going to give you nightmares real quick of just PTSD, they lost against Washington State this weekend, which was a good school, and they're still going to beat someone, is Oregon State. Like, you go into there at night and voodoo happens. It's like going to LSU at night. Like, just things happen in a football game that shouldn't, and that is Washington State's the same way. Like, I don't know what it is that teams sleep on Washington State. They'll go in there and they're like, oh, we'll just outscore them. And it's like, and on that day, it's like, no, you're not. The kid throws for 900 yards and 9 touchdowns, and you're just like, God. And then the very next week, Washington State like loses to Arizona. Like, that's the way it works out.
I mean, that's how the Pac-12 has been the last probably 7 or 8 years.
But, as we wrap up the college picks, just giving a little bit, I'm not asking for your diehards. It's more to take a step back and look at who we picked in our CFPs and where we think we are right now with our picks. So both of us had Michigan number 1. We both had USC number 2, I believe. You had Georgia or Bama 3 and Georgia 4. I had Bama 3, and then I had Notre Dame 4. For me, the only school that I really like right now is USC. Like, Bama, in my opinion, if they made it, would I be ecstatic? 100%. I'm telling you right now, it's not going to happen. That is, if they gave me 10,000 to $1 at Vegas, I still wouldn't throw $1 on it because I didn't want to lose $1. Like, I just don't see that happening. Michigan, I think, can still win. You don't know who Michigan is. Notre Dame, the problem is they lost to Ohio State. If I had to put another team in, I sort of feel like this is the year. Like, if there's a year that the SEC doesn't make the playoffs, it's this year. Like, my dad has been saying this for the past few weeks. Anytime I need like solid football advice, I just call up my dad. He was like, this is the year that a dark horse wins. That like
the whole thing?
Yeah, the whole thing. He's like, this is
like Washington?
Yeah, someone like Washington that no one really thought, but it's just like everyone else is down.
Penn State.
Yeah, or maybe it's like Wazoo. Like, Wazoo just comes out of nowhere and just stays hot on offense. Like, you just don't. It's one of those years that the team that no one really thought would be in it is going to be in it at the end of the year and win it all.
This is why I can't wait for the 12th team, because although I want to agree with you, I just can't. Because, again, I don't see anybody beating Georgia in their remaining schedule. So the only way I see them losing is possibly in the SEC championship against someone like Bama. And if that happens, I honestly don't know if I could come up with a scenario that they still don't put Georgia in. Like, that's the way the committee works, and that's how biased the committee is with these 4 teams, is they will put Georgia in, guaranteed. Unless they slip up randomly, which, again, I just don't see happening because their schedule is so easy. That's not going to happen. I would love for that to happen. I was all on board with TCU, and I didn't think they deserved to be in the national championship either. I was with everybody else, but how strong I felt about they were there because they won. Like, you got to let the boys play, and they beat Michigan. I don't care if you don't think they're a good team. They beat Michigan. They belong there, right? Like, I'm all about that. So I would love that. I just do not see it happening. My teams all still have a shot because I still am strong on USC because, again, Caleb Williams and that offense is possibly the best in the country. I think the only teams that could even rivalry it are also in the Pac-12. So if USC can survive the Pac-12 gamut, they're in. Again, I just made my case for Georgia. I know you're kind of a self-deprecating Bama hater, but again, I don't think Bama stumbles anymore. And if they can show up, they're the one team. The only way they make it is if they do beat Georgia in the SEC championship.
Yeah, they can't lose.
So the other team, obviously Michigan, and I do still think Michigan is good. I know we've talked about they haven't looked amazing, but they still don't look like they're in any danger of losing any games.
Correct. I'm not knocking them out of my CFP. It's more just they're not running the football, like beating teams, like you said, convincingly, which I'm sure that there's Michigan fans out there that are like, they're still winning. And it's like, yes, you are.
I guess it's just the word you want to use, like convincingly versus like by a lot of points, I think are maybe two different things. Because again, in like Georgia struggled. Again, they almost lost to South Carolina. Bama did lose to Texas, right? Like I know Ohio State played Notre Dame and that was a good game, but like these teams are looking very vulnerable. Even though again Michigan hasn't looked good, at no point have I thought they were going to like lose a game.
No, but I will say he did throw 3 picks against Bowling Green, and you were like, yo, dog, it's Bowling Green. Can you stop this? Like, every fan in the stadium was like, please don't start this now. Like,
so the one other team that Texas obviously I think has a good shot, but then the one other team that I want to bring up, and I think it's funny because when we originally filmed episode 1, remember we kind of made our picks, and I sat there for like 20 minutes, 30 minutes afterwards, and I was like, dude, I picked Florida State to go to the CFP. I was like, we gotta refilm that. Like, I can't go out there with that pick. That's ridiculous. And here we are. I think they actually have a good shot. So if Bama can't pull it out and Georgia easily, handedly wins, I could see Florida State sneaking in there with, Georgia, Michigan, maybe USC or Texas.
I don't think it happens in the AP poll when the CFP rankings come out. If everything is sort of still the same in terms of like Florida State's undefeated, let's say Ohio State and Michigan are still, or Penn State's undefeated, when does Georgia fall out of the number 1 seed? Like, that has to be addressed. Like, Georgia is not the Georgia from last year.
No.
Like, they're not that. And as much as I love to hate on Stetson Bennett, like, he played very well. Beck ain't Stetson Bennett.
Georgia's clearly not the best team in the nation. Period. Clearly not. They're good. I'm not saying that they're not deserving of it. They're just clearly not the number 1 team. But you're right.
Yes.
When does that happen?
When does that happen? Because I sit back and I'm like, well, Florida State's beaten LSU. They went into Clemson, won. I get it wasn't pretty, but they beat the teams that they needed to beat. Same with Ohio State goes to Notre Dame. It's like you sit back and you go, when the CFP rankings come out, that's what I tell everyone is the first week. Now, it's never happened where the first 4 teams that the CFP ranking they rank as the number 4 make it to the end. They always fall out. But what it does is it really lets you know how the committee feels.
And this is why I don't like the committee though, because as fans, we want to go like, you're the number 1, prove it. Like,
yes.
we want the proof. The committee doesn't like they don't look for that. They say they do, but
they don't release their votes. Like, you need every person on the committee should have to give in their ballot of how I rank these teams. That way, everyone can see. Oh, these people are morons.
And I mean, you can just go back historically and see the teams that they've put in there, and it's like they're not looking for the proof. They're looking for the ratings and the good matchups. I mean, last year was a perfect example. Like, the reason they didn't put Ohio State and Michigan was because they wanted them to earn that redemption game. Like, they don't look at it as fans. We're looking at it from fans, and it's just, I'll tell you what I want. Yeah, I'll tell you what I want, but then I'll tell you what I actually think the committee's going to do, and it's going to be the opposite because they're not looking at it from a fan's point of view.
100%. 100%. So, I mean, ultimately going forward, it's college football only gets better from here. Like, we're getting into the meat of the schedule. The cupcakes, although they're still persisting here and there, it's a lot less steady. It's becoming the more meat. So we'll try to get together probably every 2 weeks from here on out, talking about the schedule. We'll continue to talk about SEC bias in the polls, how much we hate the CFP committee. So if you don't like any of that, stop tuning in because that's not going to stop, especially once the rankings come out. I'm sure that we're just going to have full-on sessions about it. We're not going to do it. We're going to try to have it out in a few weeks. One of the things we are going to talk about, just to give a little taste of what's to come outside of us doing these weekly reviews, we're going to go over the 12-team playoff and just sort of the implications for it, because it's not right now, so no one's like really focused on it, but there are like amazing things that come out of this. One of which I think happens is you sort of talked about this, the committee's going to change how they rank these teams, because they're no longer forced to like, I have to build these like favorable matchups. I can now take and just give these dark horses. Like, I think all the way back to the first CFP, the team, I believe they were undefeated going into it, TCU, with Boykin as quarterback. Like, when they put in Ohio State, people were furious because they were like, Ohio State doesn't belong. Happened that Ohio State won it all, and they let them in. But there's teams like that I think every year we sort of look back and you're like, I would have not wanted to play that team.
Bama, yeah. The year Bama won it, they did the same thing.
Yeah, those are the type. And Auburn got left out. There's schools that you sit back that you go, if these teams had gotten their chance, what would have happened? It's going to happen. We'll go into depth of like how it's going to look, because there's a little bit that is different from normal CFP rankings. So we'll do an episode on that, and that will come out probably here in about a month or so. We'll see what's we're able to get done, but just a little taste of what else is to come from college football. But outside of that, you get anything else?
Nope. Thanks for tuning in.
See you next week. Time to pull chalks.